Welcome to the final online session of Smart Cities Week before we move into some in-person events, panels, sessions. Today we're joined together to talk about measuring well-being in a panel that will be hosted by Natalie from the Urban Advisory. Before we get started, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land, on which we meet today, and pay our respects to their elders past and present. I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Islander people here today. So today we're going to look at how data can be used for measuring well-being and what that means for the future of our cities. We're joined by expert practitioners from across the built environment and data analytics profession to consider the new technology which is allowing us to gather well-being data, look at how it can be implemented in our well-being frameworks, why it's important, and how to make sure that we are acting ethically. The discussion will be contextualizing the key legislative changes that we're seeing and offer a directive for many government agencies wanting to deliver well-being. So I'm going to mute myself now and cancel out the loud noise of Swinburne University and hand over to Natalie, who will do an introduction to the other panelists.
Kia ora, thank you for the introduction. Kia ora koutou to all our listeners, ngā mihi mahana kia koutou. I'd just like to kind of start our session with a karakia that was kindly gifted to us because I think it kind of sets the scene for our conversation today. Whaia, 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 ko te manakitanga, ko te kaitiakitanga, ko te whakapono, ko te mahitahitanga, kia tai atu tātou, ki pai tata, ki pai tawhiti. Kia tuturu, ka whakamaua, kia tina, tina, haumie, huie, tai kie. That really speaks to all of us needing to kind of jointly pursue, care for one another, so that we can kind of lay hold of both distant and close horizons. And I think it sets the scene for today's panel, which I'm really pleased to be bringing together this wonderful group of people, to talk about the journey that we're on to unlock some of the barriers to both understanding and delivering well-being in our neighbourhoods. I hope everyone listening kind of feels a bit like a fly on the wall at a delightful long lunch, as I'm able to kind of talk with everyone and we're able to sort of have, I hope, a really deep conversation, albeit within our time constraints, about these different aspects of well-being. So without kind of further ado, some introductions. So yes, I'm Natalie Allen, kia ora. I'm a director at the Urban Advisory. We're a team of urban advisors working across Aotearoa, New Zealand. We specialise in supporting those who are delivering transformational outcomes in town and city centres through regeneration programs, wellbeing monitoring and evaluation frameworks, innovative housing models, and kind of multi-stakeholder urban development projects. I'm joined by Professor Charles Walker. He has experience as a practicing architect and academic in both New Zealand and abroad. His work really focuses on an awareness and acknowledgement of the processes and ideas that kind of brought us to where we are today, and the ethical obligations of people in the wider environment. And I think, that plays in very well to that well-being for whom question. So in 2020, I guess amid the pandemic, Charles and his team established Hure Tau, which is the School of Future Environments at Auckland University of Technology, and they promote transformative socio-technical education and research across architecture, engineering, construction, regenerative ecologies and creative technologies. And so that really brings together a lot of this thinking, and I think it adds an important layer to the conversation around educating the next generation. I'm also joined by Dr. Crystal Olin, who has recently, or next week, will be beginning a role as an architectural design lecturer at Victoria University of Wellington. She has an academic background in both urban design and architecture, and has had roles in various levels of government and the private sector, which has seen her kind of gain experience in governance, master planning and placemaking, and all of this she brings to her kind of qualitative and quantitative research, which sort of looks at how we shape our conceptualization of place, and particularly our approaches to placemaking, place attachment, and design in the built environment. And I hope that can help us kind of move towards discussions about the relationship between well-being and design as part of today's session. I'm also pleased to welcome Dr. Guy Penny, who whakapabas to Ngāti Kahungunu ki Wairoa. And he's a geographer, scientist, engineer with an interest in the systems that humans interact with and in the environment. His specialty research has seen him work with government, Māori organisations, business and universities to kind of develop, understand and apply values, knowledge and processes to support healthy communities and environments. And much of this work has looked at sustainable resource use, healthy housing, and integrating Mataranga Māori, Māori knowledge into development processes. So again, a really significant layer to today's conversation, and particularly in our context kind of here in Aotearoa. But I think many useful things to share more widely abroad also. And last but by no means least, Dr. David Maeda, who's a senior advisor in evaluation and research at Kāinga Ora Homes and Communities, New Zealand's public housing developer. His work at Kāinga Ora involves developing outcomes, monitoring and evaluation frameworks to understand how housing developments are delivering on the organisations and the wider government's wellbeing goals. So, very applicable to today's conversation and very deeply embedded in this evolving measurement space in New Zealand. So thank you all very much for joining us, and to the panelists in advance for agreeing to be part of this and have a conversation with us. Essentially, I wanted to kind of start with a big question, but maybe not so much as, why wellbeing is important or what is it. I think that will come out hopefully in the kind of nuance of our conversation. But I did want to start by asking why it is important to measure well-being before we dive into the how. Crystal, would you like to kind of start us off?
Sure. I guess the thought I had around this question was thinking way back to why do we even build cities? Why do we live in cities in the first place? And the whole idea of building a city and living in it is to exist and survive in a self-sufficient kind of way, a collection of individuals and communities, right? But we know now that just surviving and existing isn't enough. We know that people need to thrive and be well. And we also know that our cities can either contribute to or detract from that well-being. But well-being is incredibly complex. And so how do we know what we're getting right and what we're not getting right unless we start to measure it? There's a lot of ideologies that go into how we design and build and live in different places, and a lot of assumptions. And unless we actually sort of unpack some of those ideologies and assumptions and get at the heart of what's really working in our cities to support people being truly well, and from a variety of different cultural backgrounds, what it means to be well, understanding that and the complexities around how our cities contribute to it, then we're not going to, I suppose we're not going to create those really great places for people that are going to sustain us and support us to thrive in the future unless we measure these things and try to understand them better.
Thanks, Crystal. I think they're all such valid points. David, can you kind of add another layer to that?
Sure, absolutely. I obviously agree with everything that Crystal said. And I think part of what Crystal was saying is that we kind of need to unpack what well-being means and how it might apply to different groups of people. And I think going back before that, there's another layer is we need to kind of think about what development means. Because if we're trying to measure well-being, we also want to unpack what precedes that, is that we're kind of in the business of or in the field of development. And I think in our field, development at face value kind of gets assigned a very positive value, in that, we're kind of refurbishing or upgrading homes, or bulldozing old homes and building new ones, or reconstructing parks and redeveloping infrastructure. And that's always a good thing because it's new and improved. But that's not always true. because development for one group of people might be better for them than for others. And so in terms of, again, going back to what Crystal said, in terms of thriving communities, how we forge development gives some people within communities a better chance to thrive than others. And that depends on their values and whatever their demographic background is. So yes, we need to unpack what well-being means, but also we kind of need to think about what development means and how that shakes out for different groups of people.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, I think that segues nicely to some of your work. Guy, would you like to kind of pick up on, this idea of defining well-being as the first step before we can figure out measuring it?
Kia ora everybody, and Ngāmihi kia koutou from Tāmaki Makaurau from Auckland, where I'm speaking to you from. Greetings to our cousins, brothers and sisters in Australia and further afield. I come from a sustainable development sort of background, and so I do agree with what has been said already. And because our communities, our cities are becoming so heterogeneous, they're so the peoples within them are so diverse. We do need to understand what well-being means for different groups. As David has mentioned, our policies, our activities around urban development, they may favour one group above another, and it may not be intentional, just because we don't understand what well-being means for individual groups. So a lot of my work recently has been around looking at what well-being means for Māori communities in urban environments. And I'm just really picking up on a lot of work that's been done here in Aotearoa, New Zealand in the past by some amazing academics and practitioners in this area. So we have a good literature on well-being from a Māori perspective, but it's quite specific to different age groups or cohorts or different places. So what we're trying to do is develop a sort of a general model for what well-being means in an urban context for Māori. And really fundamentally, when you do a literature review and you look across all these different models that have been around for a while and new ones have been developed, you see a couple of common themes across them all. And for Māori, and it's probably true for many peoples, relationships are really the heart of well-being. So it's the nature and quality of your relationships. And for Māori, identity and belonging are key factors that underpin well-being. So you look at the relationships that help to support identity. And in Māori, we have a long history of what we call tikanga, which is really our so much rules, but our processes. It's the protocols we use, the rituals we use when we enter into relationships, and that we approach relationships from, and that we expect others to approach relationship as well. But I'm also talking about relationship with the environment. For Māori, identity is wound up very closely with the natural environment, and our waiata, our kōrero, our whakatauaki, our sayings, our proverbs, our carvings, even our names, they express and demonstrate our relationship to the environment. So one of the aspects of our work is for designers, developers, and so forth, to look at developing urban environments that enable and facilitate a relationship with the environment. Whether that's just more sunlight, whether that's having access to the takutai moana, the marine coastal area, having access to the ngāhere, the bush and the forest, and so that we can get to those places and we can interact with them So in relationships have many strands. I mean, I can go on for hours probably, but relationships have many strands. And from a Māori point of view, the spiritual relationship is probably takes a priority. So we have to think of ways of facilitating, enabling, regenerating ways that we can spiritually connect to the natural environment through our built environment. Our physical health is also very important, obviously, and there's many aspects of that which are quite well known across many different cultures. Relationships with the environment also support mental health, which again is a key part of Māori well-being. And finally, the key part for Māori is the focus is not on individuals. Māori exist in a network of relationships through whakapapa. That's through their genealogical connections to people in place. So the beauty of whakapapa is that it tells you where you fit in the story, and it gives you a role. You're the next in line. You've got to perpetuate this, our culture. It helps with belonging because you know exactly where you belong in the scheme of things. So when whakapapa are lost and these connections are lost, and access to resources is fragmented or resources are polluted or what have you, then that really impacts those things that support Māori well-being. I'm sure others have got to say more, so I'll just stop there for now.
No, kia ora, Guy. Thank you for adding all that beautiful nuance to how we think about well-being. And I think it's really fair to say that this complexity hasn't been previously captured in the way that we've tried to kind of measure well-being. And I guess if we think about why it's important, it's because we still kind of are operating in a system whereby decision-making gets very tied to often how things are measured and recorded and reported on, how things are embedded in business cases, etc. And I think, what you've shared with us really challenges and, questions that traditional approach. And so it's a matter of really looking at, how can we, genuinely embed these voices and these, needs and aspirations into our measurement frameworks, or do we need to shift, what they are in order to actually make sure that the core purpose at the end of the day is actually helping all these development entities to deliver better environments with the people that live in them, and better environments for those environments as well. David, I just wanted to kind of pick up on a few points around this idea of traditional measurement, and for those tuning in as well, it's been an interesting journey. Our team kind of started working with Kāinga Ora on outcomes monitoring and evaluation for a large-scale program some years ago. And what's been fantastic is to see how the thinking has evolved, and David's team has now picked that up. He's been able to kind of work with Guy, who's been working with Crystal. You can kind of see how it's a web, to really better embed these local voices in the process. And I think it's kind of important to speak to that journey and the shifts that are happening between how we kind of traditionally measure and what we're moving towards. So yeah, David, could you share some of your kind of observations about the transition that's been happening?
Kapai. Sure. So one of the things that I've been working on here at Kāinga Ora is the outcomes monitoring for a community called Eastern Porirua, which is just north of Wellington on the north island of Aotearoa, New Zealand. And in terms of a baseline, because that development is just starting, we're still in the very early stages of building new homes and upgrading homes and parks and rebuilding infrastructure and things like that. So one of the things we've been doing is looking at secondary data to see where we are on different measures. And so the secondary data we're looking at is from the census It's from big surveys that are administered across different cities in Aotearoa, like there's a quality of life survey that's administered across 8 cities, including Porirua as a whole. And then the city itself has its own resident survey, and that's conducted annually. So these different sources of information, they'll collect all kinds of data from those who participate on things like education and training and families and health and travel and public transport, the built and natural environment, climate change, infrastructure, city facilities, so on and so forth. So we have all this information to draw on. But I want to go back to what Guy said, is that for certain groups of people, and here in Aotearoa, the Mana Whenua or the indigenous population Māori, as well as a lot of other groups, relationships are absolutely key. And so there might be measures in those different surveys on something like climate change. And a survey might be asking the participants to agree or strongly agree with a statement, or to rate something like air quality or water quality or something like that, which kind of taps into the environment. But it's quite limited. So I'm not saying any of those surveys are bad by any means. They have great information and very useful information, but they tend not to dig in deep enough into relationships. And so the community that Natalie and the Urban Advisory were working with back in 2019 and 20, and that we've kind of taken over, again, Eastern Porirua, it's a small community of about 19,000 residents. About 3,500 of those are Māori. About 12,000 of them are diverse Pacific peoples. So amongst the Pacific population, about 57% are Samoan, 22% Cook Island, 16% Tokelauan, and then 3% or less of Tongan, Niuean, Fijian, and other Pacific peoples. And so given that that's the kind of demographic in that community, we need to think, and I want to give a big acknowledgement to Guy because he advised us in setting up a conceptual framework for how we conduct research. We have to follow the proper tikanga, or as he said, the kind of protocols and processes, the rituals or rules that work with people in that community. And something that Guy, I think, didn't say was we need to establish the right connections, or whanangatanga, but doing that is going through the processes or the whakawhanangatanga to establish those relationships with the community. And if we do that correctly, then hopefully we can have different values or different concepts that are valued from people from those ethnic groups emanate in the research. So I'll stop talking in just a second, but let me give a tangible example of this. So let's say one of the values that we want to kind of unpack in our research is wairuatanga, or spirituality, or from the Tuvaluan perspective, the concept would be oanga whakate nganga. How do we get at spirituality in a survey question? Or how do we get at like guardianship or kaitiakitanga in a survey question? Because yeah, quantitative data can be useful, although it's not the only way that we can measure well-being. We could have in a survey, a survey item that has those Likert scales from strongly agree to strongly disagree. And maybe the statement could be, my family and I feel connected with the natural environment in and around insert community X. And it's really trying to tap more tangibly into that relationship between the survey respondent and the natural environment. If we're trying to get at something like unity or kotahitanga, we could have a survey statement like, there is a culture of caring and giving for others and the environment in, and then insert community. So it's developing, it's measuring if there's a relationship that's being enhanced amongst people and or the built and natural environment. So that's kind of what we're trying to do. And I think other people are also going to say, hey, we can't just do this through quantitative survey data gathering. We can also have actual korero, talanoa, or conversations with residents to get it. Kind of some of the how and why these different phenomena are happening or not happening.
Yeah, thanks, David. That's fantastic. I think kind of the other layer I just want to loop in here, Charles, is around kind of education and pick up on kind of Guy's key point, because I think in order to do this work that David discussed and to kind of think differently about how data can be gathered and put alongside kind of quantitative and merged together in our assessment tools. I think that, you know, education is so critical. Can you just talk to how you're evolving your thinking at AUT in this space?
It's still evolving. I guess what's interesting about the school that we set up in 2020, the School of Future Environments, is that it's not based around any particular discipline. You know, so I think that's an important thing that we've tried to do. And that if you think about the way universities and education systems are organized around disciplines, these disciplines were essentially how Europeans saw how to break down knowledge into manageable kind of fields in the 17th century. And I think that when we come up against kind of Te Amari, where there isn't that idea that areas of knowledge are kind of separated out, that everything is connected, I think that's a really kind of fundamental kind of shift, challenging for both sides, I think, in that, you know, we've arguably shown a great deal of kind of human development and progress by breaking things down and analyzing the kind of elementary particles, if you like, and that has got us to where we are now. But the challenge for us now is to join those things up again in some meaningful way. And, you know, one of the issues around education is that we ask kids to make decisions in their teens about their kind of future career paths, the kind of knowledge, the kind of things that they want to find out about, when they don't really have any knowledge about that. And so we've tried to kind of, albeit in a limited way, we've tried to connect up and break down some of these disciplinary barriers. And I think that our school is really about kind of relationships again and connections, this idea that, and I guess relationship connections now are being kind of rethought. So we're looking at kind of relationships with people, environment, sure, people, things. In a new way. And I think that's kind of interesting. We're at this kind of very early stage of this, but we're also looking at a kind of arguably a paradigm shift in the way that we understand knowledge and learning. You know, when we talk about technology, for example, we immediately think about kind of advanced technologies or current technologies, but our environment has always been technologized. You know, the first time you build anything, make a tool, that's technology. And so technology and the built environment have historically, since humankind, have formed a kind of second nature. Another, you know, I mean, this is a Marxist term, and I'm not quite buying into it, but the idea is that technology forms this second nature. It's what allows us to live in the real world that we can't even really perceive with our limited senses. So technology allows us to exist on the planet in some way. And I think we're looking at in terms of the School of Future Environments doesn't really make any, well, we don't really want to make any distinction between different understandings. So understanding of the term environment, so it could be, you know, built, it could be natural, which is what is natural now, it could be artificial, it could be technological, it could be economic or cultural or political, because we all live in these kind of umwelts that, you know, limited by our own understanding. And so this notion of well-being becomes really critical because, you know, I think Guy mentioned, well-being isn't really about individuals anymore. Of course, health and goodness is felt at individual level, but it's really kind of cultural, social, institutional. And people have different understandings of what it is. You know, we alluded to this earlier, you know, for some people it's kind of not being ill, some people it's being, you know, living the good life. For some people it's just about being happy, the pursuit of happiness. Is happiness the same as well-being, for example? But one of the things I'm kind of interested in terms of the built environment really is that the role of kind of built environment disciplines is to, again, go beyond the individual. We're much less interested in building houses for wealthy people, but I'm much more interested in building these kind of third places. I mean, Oldenburg and other sociologists talk about the third place being places between home, domestic, private life, and work. And those kind of social spaces are the spaces where architecture and urban design have a contribution to make. It's where people meet other people. And I think that becomes the critical thing. So, you know, cafes, parks, green spaces, sports grounds, recreation spaces, you know, and we're only beginning to understand this on at a kind of local level in Aotearoa. So, you know, for some time, when I came here 25 years ago, a lot of the discussion around urban design was really trying to create some kind of neo-European plaza, you know, civic square, whatever. And those models are perhaps not really the best here. You know, perhaps the civic space here is the bay. You know, perhaps the civic space is the beach, or the rugby ground, or whatever. So we're really trying to kind of rethink what that means. And then in terms of the kind of, sorry, I'm talking, just stop me, I'm talking too much, I'm not getting to the point. But the other aspect of kind of relationships connection I'm very interested in is what is this new approach, a new understanding of data mean for these ideas about relationships and connections? Because data forms relationships that we can't necessarily perceive at a kind of sensory level. So when we talk about subjective and objective and qualitative, quantitative, perhaps data moves us into this new space that is at another level, because it starts to kind of form patterns that we can hopefully discover, perceive, reproduce. And I think that's where it connects with placemaking for me, that the understanding of patterns, the way that we occupy space, the way that we occupy the world, depends on our kind of mental maps of how to do things with each other, you know? And so I think that the data and the whole idea of kind of digital twins raises architecture, urban design, and design into this other space that we don't quite understand. And I think I mentioned to you before, Natalie, that I think we're in terms of kind of data technologies, we're in the kind of the silent black and white phase of this communication technology. And I think we don't really know what to do with it. We don't really know what, you know. But I've been interested for a long time, been interested in an architect called Christopher Alexander, who was also a mathematician, and he wrote about pattern languages and in architecture. And of course, in architecture, that was taken up for a few months and then ignored because it didn't seem to offer creativity, individuality, whatever. And they kind of missed the fundamental message of Alexander, was that the world is structured in these kind of patterns and that are kind of independent to some extent of time and space. So different cultures have different ways of interacting with their environment, but at one level, they're kind of patterns that can be recognized. And what's interesting is that computer scientists took up this idea of Alexander's, and they started looking at kind of code and, you know, relationships between things. And so computer science has developed artificial intelligence, machine learning, not based entirely on Alexander's ideas, but based on this idea of kind of replicable patterns. And I think that's very, very interesting, that connection between architecture and data is kind of mathematical, if you like. And so we've been trying to look at that. How do we make the paradigm shift in the design of our environments that goes beyond the old arguments about computers are not as good as pencils, or, you know, hand sketching is important. What does that really mean?
Just to pick up on that, Charles, I mean, I think what is exciting about that space is that, you know, when we explore that, I should say, I think that's where we'll get to a much more inclusive space, because when we think about patterns, they can be, you know, a lot more diverse and representative of the people that are actually in those spaces. I know we've been conducting some research, our team in partnership with the University of Auckland Business School and Professor Deborah Levy, looking at town centres and wellbeing, and you know, the disconnect for many very important groups in New Zealand between those kind of essentially sort of public spaces, even though they're delivered by all types of different entities, from the market, you know, to the community sector. But there's this sense of kind of lacking identity and needing to infuse that, because it's so connected to well-being. And I think kind of better understanding the opportunity that data has to actually enable us to be more inclusive about everyone's patterns is going to be a key kind of.
Yeah, I guess the other thing that interests me is that the idea of, you know, data and collecting data has become the source of discussion around kind of privacy and invasiveness and so on. How do we collect kind of personal anonymized data? And there are various ways of doing it. Of course, you know, we know those ways, but there's still a kind of sense that the smart city, the technological city, the data environment is people are suspicious of it because they've seen how technology has tended to be misused in the past. You know, and I'm not one of these people who says technology is neutral, not at all. But you know, and I'm interested in one of the things I'm interested in is like how things like science fiction introduce some of these ideas into the public consciousness, but mostly in a dystopian way. You know, so like the Terminator, or people being kind of monitored or kind of scanned, or facial recognition technologies are kind of become really controversial because of the kind of the biases embedded in the technology. But yet, you know, they do offer on the positive side, they do offer kind of insights. And as we develop a kind of greater understanding of this world, I mean, maybe, I don't know, I'm not arguing for or against this, but, you know, I know people being experimenting with basic kind of empathic AIs, emotional AIs, trying to pick up on kind of emotional subjective states, and developing kind of background computing, you know, Ubicom, quiet computing as something that just, again, recedes into the background, which is also scary, that, you know, we inhabit this technologized environment that becomes natural. And perhaps that reveals ways of understanding emotional, physiological, intellectual states. But, you know, it's early days, it's black and white.
Our transition to, you know, smart cities being a form of digital empath in a way, an inclusive empath. It's a very interesting concept indeed.
Also scary and manipulative.
Well, the two sides of a coin, I guess. I just also wanted to shout out to everyone listening to say that we will have some time for questions. So I believe the chat is now safe if people want to start putting questions in there. We'll probably pick up on some of those towards the end of the conversation. So if, you know, this is spurring thoughts, etc., for you that you'd like to kind of have the panel touch on further, please pop them in the chat for us. So Crystal, I kind of wanted to pass the baton to you for a moment, and then we'll kind of ask everyone around, I guess, the role of design in all this. I think we've sort of touched on it in some ways, but it's definitely, you know, really, this is where the kind of rubber hits the road in a sense. And I think measurement frameworks, if done well, can be great for that brokering and aligning and getting everyone kind of paddling in the same direction, if you will, which is sort of critical if we're going to get, you know, public spend and private spend to all amalgamate together. But, you know, it's very much about how do we operationalize that, and a lot of that is about how we actually design, you know, these environments and what shifts we need to have. So can you speak to that for a moment?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Natalie. There's probably lots to be said on this, and I'm not sure I'll touch all the important points. But when thinking about design, I always think about two really important aspects just to start off the bat. And one is the design process itself, or the processes. And then the other is the outcomes and whatever kind of environments that we end up designing or shaping. And like Charles said, those can be all sorts of emerging environments: physical, the built, the natural, but also the technological, the emotional, and then going, you know, tapping into these ideas that Guy mentioned. There might be all sorts of possibilities in terms of gaining understanding and across different cultural spheres. So there's the outcomes, which are incredibly important and complex. But I think the design processes is just where I want to start at the moment. And that's something that can be missed out when we get really excited about a new technology, or we get really excited about a data set, or we get really excited about perhaps a style of designing, or an approach that has got a lot of buy-in in the international community, or whatever it is. Charles mentioned how when he first came to Aotearoa, New Zealand, there was a lot of emphasis on the sort of traditional European plaza. I come from the States originally, and when I first came to New Zealand, it took me quite a while to sort of acclimate to how things work here, and come to a real understanding over time that actually some of those assumptions from the States, so from my studies in Europe, weren't necessarily translatable here, or they weren't translatable in an immediate simplistic way. They had validity, but only when adapted and reconsidered. And with all of these kinds of things that we want to try and design, we need to do them with and for the people that are ultimately going to be living in those environments. So I think it's a really important role of design in all of this, in ensuring well-being, so that we get those processes right. I've heard from some of my Maori colleagues saying that says, do nothing about us without us. And that should be something that we think about for all communities, in terms of bringing people along or enabling people who are going to be living in those places we design to actually lead or co-lead those processes. And also incorporating those tikanga, those protocols and rituals that Guy spoke to, and getting that right, so that there is something that people fall in love with about the outcome, because they were a part of it, and they understand and they believe in the process and the rituals by which it was created. And just going back to the outcome side of what we actually do design, as you mentioned, Natalie, it's really tricky to try and actually operationalize what it is we know we want to try to achieve, sometimes from the data that's coming through. So I think in our designers, we need really clever collaborations, and we need to be thinking across scales, and we need to be thinking about those long-term sort of the practicalities of actually realizing something we might be aspiring to. So that's not just pie in the sky thinking in terms of what we try to achieve, but it's aspirational, but realistic, so that we actually do make progress in terms of inching our way, however slowly or clumsily, toward that paradigm shift that Charles mentioned, or that incredible complexity of environments in which we all gain a better understanding of each other and support each other's well-being. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but a few thoughts anyway wrapped around it.
I mean, I think there's many layers to this. I know that for us, in terms of a design space, it's come down to also supporting or using kind of measures and indicators to support, in some instances, changing like the funding model or how partnerships are created, so that the actual briefs can be quite different. Because I think, you know, sometimes, let's talk sort of town centre regeneration, it might be that a master plan is kind of crafted, and you know, there'll be a key prominent corner site, for example, and it's fantastic to have ideas about what that could be, but in many instances, what would kind of bring about success in that space is actually, you know, joining together all the different entities. Maybe it's about creating a different financial stack, so that iwi can be a key partner with a financial return. There might be a phenomenal community group who could, you know, leverage off land that they own, but they don't have operational costs. Council could kind of want some key outcomes and be able to contribute, but not have enough funds to do the whole project on their own. You know, leveraging off, whether it's government as anchor tenants, etc., the expertise of developers and their ability to actually support and enable delivery. It's kind of brokering all these things and unlocking that by saying, hey, our agreed picture of success is this outcome. You know, that that people are feel empowered economically in this area, or that there's strong local creation of wealth. And then it's a case of, you know, that corner site becomes a key sort of innovation hub that's this partnership model. If that gets set up, then chances are the design brief will be vastly different from what it could have been. And it's also more likely to get delivered, because these partners are kind of there going on the journey together with that sort of shared sense of direction. So I think that's where, you know, the measures to enable these types of essentially design outcomes are really critical. Did anyone else want to speak to that further? Oh, sorry, Crystal.
No, just to reiterate what you're saying, or to back it up, I suppose that was my experience working in local government, was you know, wonderful ambitions and wonderful people working on projects that had a lot of merit, but quite siloed quite often, and because of those measuring the KPIs or whatever it was, the targets that each group was trying to meet, being siloed off in a certain way that wasn't sort of translatable across to the other organizations that could have been collaborated with or should have been collaborated with, or groups, not just organizations, but also groups of people and individuals and communities and entrepreneurs. So.
Yeah, and I think that's where, you know, the work that David's doing, Guy's research in this space, kind of challenges those silos, because it takes us to a deeper understanding of the bigger picture of well-being. And so I think when we have that, we can leverage off that to actually, you know, justify this additional thinking about what well-being really means, and then, you know, look at this more complex, intricate way of measuring it. And I say complex and intricate, but it doesn't necessarily mean, you know, more costly, etc. It's actually a much more kind of efficient, in many ways, use of resources, because you're able to kind of build off everyone's contribution. But it does require a shift in thinking, and that's, I think, the real challenge, but, you know, hopefully the space that we're all working in. Yeah, did anyone else want to kind of add to that?
Yeah, Natalie, I was just going to say that, yeah, obviously these social spaces that Charles referenced, they're contested spaces. Just like we saw some spam come up here, right? You know, so there are rules that there's this concept about the social construction of well-being that I've talked to Crystal about for quite some length recently. So what's in those spaces can determine what activities are acceptable and for whom and so forth. So when those spaces are being designed, you're absolutely right, the inclusion of people who are going to be using those spaces, it has to be there. So it goes back to these partnership models like the Te Tiriti o Waitangi here in Aotearoa, getting mana whenua, so those are the Māori who are, have authority over certain areas, to be included in those design stages, so that their values can be, well, not just included, but they are part of the team, and so the values can be, you know, present in the design process and flow through. And so, I mean, there's probably some data collection required around the design process itself and who's involved and what has been left out, rather than what's just in there. And yes, so the physical environment is very important, but the social environment is equally important. What narrative really dominates in a space? So people who might act differently or have different values can't go to those spaces because they don't feel free to express their culture, and they don't get this cultural endorsement that is required to support and their own cultures, if you like. So yeah, that's just a point to make. They're contested, and they're always contested. They continue to be contested. So unless our political processes are more inclusive, you know, it's going to be very incremental, these wellbeing outcomes for all people.
Yeah, that's a fantastic point, and, you know, also extends to our different key demographic groups. For example, you know, younger people and how they're able to interact in space. You know, gender, young girls, how they're able to use these environments, and sort of the various layers of social pressure, I guess, that play into to their narrative in these environments is really critical. Thank you, Guy. I mean, I think the essence of that is that, you know, this not just inclusion, but kind of being able to really shape the narrative is sort of intrinsic to the success of delivering wellbeing. So thank you for that. Just to our audience, Tom sent through a book for us, and we have a few questions coming through. So we've sort of got just under 10 minutes before we wrap up for everyone on their lunch breaks if you're in Australia, or afternoon tea breaks if you're over here in Aotearoa. So do you think there is value in using AI as a neutral design aid, you know, collating the community inputs, using the AI to visualize what that might look like in practice? Question to the team.
I think that's a fascinating idea. It would be a wild experiment.
How long have I been doing this? I think yes and no. I mean, I think that AI has been around for nearly 100 years and it hasn't really achieved anything particularly sensational in terms of really, really important kind of socio-cultural, ethical kind of solutions. It's dealt with, dare I say, simple things. But that's what I was saying before. I think we're on the verge of something perhaps that will kind of change our relationship to artificial intelligence in some way. And so I don't think it will ever be, I don't think technology is ever really neutral. You know, I don't think AI is this kind of neutral. We already see when you use even the chat GPT, you get stuff that is already biased. So, you know, I think we need to, the value of the kind of human designer up until now has been the ability to kind of filter the results of this technology, to be able to kind of make value judgments. And again, at the end of the day, that's what designers get paid for, isn't it? About making judgments in difficult circumstances and trying to balance different kind of inputs and so on. I think, I mean, I go back to Guy's thing around storytelling. I think, you know, narrative, because I think I was going to say earlier, I think storytelling is a technology. You know, it's these provide the myths, the stories by which we live. And so that becomes, to a large extent, our artificial intelligence or our whatever, intrinsic intelligence. And we can manipulate stories and we can fantasize and we can make things that don't exist in stories. And I think we can also make space, I mean, back to the point about the spaces that we design, does every space have to be completely inclusive? Or is there value in spaces that are exclusive? I mean, you want to go where your like minds are. You want to go to the kind of goth club, or you want to go to the, you know, whatever your thing is, gamers convention or whatever. And you don't want everyone there because you want to belong somewhere. You want to be in your culture, in your identity. So, you know, I think that we have to have a kind of plurality of spaces. And our public space doesn't necessarily mean open to everyone, but you know, perhaps or maybe public space does, but social space doesn't, or something. Maybe there's a different kind of reading of those spaces that is possible.
Thanks, Charles. Just another question I wanted to raise from the floor before we wrap up. How are relationships and their values currently incorporated in ratings or certification systems applying to the built environment? You know, green star communities, well, etc., and sort of precincts, smart buildings in cities, and who are not kind of currently defining these aspirational indicators and metrics? It's a very, very good question.
Just from my experience looking at a lot of secondary sources, I think that survey designers are getting better and have actually actioned gathering information on relationships between people in different communities, where I don't think I don't think they've gone far enough with that, but that is happening. I think the next step is, how do we see people developing or not developing relationships with Te Ao or the environment, however that's defined. I haven't seen much, if anything, of that in a lot of the secondary data that's out there. And so that's where we need to grow in terms of our profession.
Mm.
Yeah, I think there's still a very strong influence we see here in New Zealand from the kind of OECD thinking that's transitioned into our living standards framework in the Treasury, and then Haere Waiora, which is the kind of Tau Māori equivalent, was created subsequently. And I think we've got a long way to go until, it sort of reminds me of, diversity on boards. In terms of sort of the governance of these certification systems, if you will, as per the question, I think there hasn't been a lot of diversity there, and it shows in some of the ways. I think there's much more effort made now, but in a New Zealand bicultural context in particular, and also because we're such a multicultural society, there has been key voices missing from the conversation. And I know that in our work we're very conscious of that, and in many instances it feels like it's a bit of a battle to kind of constantly try and overcome that, and that's where I kind of hope this sort of part of the world can start to really lead the way in terms of us moving beyond some of those systems that have kind of been gifted to the world. And that's where I think that this subjective data, the work that Guy and David are doing, can really start to sort of shift how some of these tools are applied. And it might be that they're applied with add-ons, or it might be that we rethink them completely here in Aotearoa. I think that will be a critical process for us to go on, for sure. So thank you for those questions, and for everyone tuning in. We're just about to finish, but were there any final comments from our wonderful panel before I wrap up and close?
I just wanted to talk to Tom about, he's in the School of Cybernetics, which that's fascinating, because it started off as a kind of system of governance, I guess, and became the kind of basis of much of what we call AI. So I might call you separately offline, Tom.
I think that's a LinkedIn friendship in the making there. Guy, you were also going to say something?
Yes, I was going to say, I mean, social scientists, there are methods to study relationships or identify them quantitatively and qualitatively. So we don't have to reinvent the world around the methods used to, research relationships. It's just like you say, Natalie, there are other disciplines, if you like, or other mātauranga, other knowledge sets that we need to apply to this area. And around identity and belonging, that's, I guess, sociology and psychology needs to be brought in as well, because I'm a geographer, I'm not, in that deep really, but I think we have the tools and expertise, amongst us as populations to look at some of these newer ideas that help us understand well-being better. That's all.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, I think kind of the comment, Charles, you made around the plurality of spaces applies to this idea of a plurality of measures as well. And I'm sure we've only kind of uncovered 3 layers of the onion of however many there are today, but I hope that it's the start of a really meaningful conversation in Australasia, really, and that we can really kind of push how we're thinking about this, and then we can get kind of the runs on the board in terms of delivering these inclusive environments going forward. I just wanted to close with another karakia that I think speaks to what we now all need to go and do, and also kind of allows us to return to our everyday activities with all this kind of new knowledge bouncing around in our brains. So, ka whakairea te tapu kia wātia ai te ara, kia turuki whakataha ai, kia turuki whakataha ai. Homie, huie, tai kie. Thank you all for joining in, and thanks once again to our wonderful panelists for sharing all your insights, and I look forward to continuing this conversation with you all. Ka kite.
Thank you so much, everybody, for joining, and a big thank you to Natalie and the Urban Advisory for hosting the session and bringing together such a fantastic group of panelists. We look forward to continuing these conversations and showing some action and impact in our next session. Thank you, everybody.